Appreciate the introduction. And I think as many of you may surmise after the intro, I've been at this for quite a few years, and through many transitions. And like most people I know, change is tough, and particularly when we see significant change, that's even tougher. In my career with the federal government, I've been through three transitions, one of which was former President Trump and now President-elect President Trump. And I will share with you, as someone who's run many federal programs, I think what we really can expect, and I'm not here to predict the future, and I don't even know if anyone can predict the future. You know, people are going to come in and need to learn their jobs, right? So anything that most of the federal government really is career folks that are working on programs just like I myself did, and they're going to continue. The wheels of government will continue to turn. Some new folks will come in, they're going to want to learn their jobs. And I think when all of that starts to come together naturally, there's going to be a bit of a slowdown and a bit of a bottleneck as people kind of learn what they're now in charge of. And so, at least for now, I think people are going to do their jobs and try to keep it moving. And I think we can anticipate some delays too, right? Because people are just going to start to have to learn their craft and share information. That said, I think where federal funding is concerned, it's kind of the little engine that kind of keeps on going. And also, what's important to know is, particularly when we talk about programs like the bipartisan infrastructure bill and all the rest of them, they are actually laws passed by Congress, and this was a bipartisan law. It was signed by the president, but it was also enacted by Congress. And so what we see is we've got programs that have been authorized, and then we have an appropriations bill, and then of course we have the allocation process through the federal agencies themselves. And so again, what we'll see is, what do all of those components look like? So it's really not just the presidential election, but obviously the congressional elections. And so I guess, we'll just wait and see. So without being able to predict anything, what I will share is, the wheels do keep turning. And so I just kind of want everyone to listen with that in mind, that, while things are going to be shifting and changing, that they're not going to go away. So I think it's in that spirit that I want to just continue to, kind of give this presentation. So, and the federal process is what it is, and that's the challenge and both the opportunity, right? Some things either just don't change or they're slow to change. And in this particular case, that can work for us because the rules have been out there for some time. And that's kind of really what I want to talk to you about today. So Anne mentioned my business, Hummingbird Collective, and I was mentioning to her that my name, Ptak, is actually a Polish name, and it means bird, and hence the hummingbird, which is the symbol of joy. And so I also want to bring that to you today. This is tedious subject matter, it's complex, but I also feel, if you can kind of bring joy to your work, and you have a good team, with a good spirit, there's just nothing we can't do. And so this is also what I really want to carry forward. There are a lot of us that know a lot about a few things, right? We don't know everything about everything. So the point is, let's get those folks together in a room and then see how we move forward. In my particular case, I come to the table as a former federal employee. I come to the table with a reviewer's mindset. I can provide a lot of insight into how federal agencies make decisions when evaluating grant proposals. 12 of those years were spent with DOT's Federal Highway Administration, where I managed several multi-million-dollar competitive grant programs, and honestly have been on evaluation teams for multiple federal agencies in which I've reviewed billions of dollars worth of grant applications. I've also spent a lot of time providing technical assistance with regard to grant writing and compliance, and decided really to focus my business on building capacity at local governments, state governments, tribal governments, all of really which became eligible entities under the bipartisan infrastructure bill and Inflation Reduction Act, many of whom had never entered the federal space before. And just like a lot of federal employees at the time, when those bills were passed, it was just kind of like drinking out of a fire hose. So we all kind of learned together. Ultimately, that led me to Reimagined, and I've definitely got a couple of my Rio colleagues here today. So thank you for coming here to support me. And we can move to the next slide and just get together and just here's what I want to talk about today. Today's objectives, if I want for us to walk away with anything today, in this next half hour, I'm going to try to abbreviate it as much as I can, a really keen understanding of how the federal life cycle works. Again, that's the train that keeps on running. That's what we know to be steady and true. Knowing what the rules of the funders are for these federal agencies and why that notice of funding opportunity, or NOFO, as I will continue to call it, is such an important document. And later on in the presentation, I've actually created a handout, and I think, Allison is making that available. I've kind of put together a little cheat sheet that I did use for our Rio partners when we decided to look at EPA's Community Change Grant. How do you get together in a room and decide, is this an opportunity or isn't it? And if not now, maybe sometime in the future. Like, how do we make those decisions together as a group? And then finally, anyone who's worked on this even a little bit knows that there's a cost associated with everything, right? Free money is never free. What are the costs associated with pursuing federal grants, and what is that impact on spending power? And then, of course, spoiler alert, I'm not going to be able to answer that question. Is the juice worth the squeeze, my friends? This is up to you to determine for yourself. My goal here really is to just help you gain better insight, so that together we can make some informed decisions, and hopefully we'll have some time for Q&A. So first and foremost, knowing the rules of the funder. And again, I want to bring home that reviewer's mindset, because that's going to be really key to this conversation. The first piece of advice I share with anyone considering federal funding is to know the rules of the funder. And don't focus, at least at first, on, is my project eligible, which is always the first question. What do you think about this project? Is it eligible? More than likely. But that said, the better question to ask ourselves, or to pose to ourselves, is, does my project align with the mission and goals of that federal agency? And in order to do that, to figure that out, we've got to do our homework. Probably we know what our project is, we know it in detail, but what is that alignment there? Is there alignment? And when we follow that trail, again, we take it all the way back to that legislation, whether it's the bipartisan infrastructure bill, IRA. And, once that bill is out there, they turn into federal programs, they turn into policies, they turn into regulations, and they ultimately become a NOFO. And again, you'll hear me use this acronym many times. And the NOFO is really the instrument that the individual federal agencies use to implement and deliver that program. Under bill, what we saw with the bipartisan infrastructure bill, there were a lot of existing programs for which bill added a lot more money to, but then there were a lot of new programs. So if any of you kind of went through this in the beginning wondering, when are these NOFOs going to drop? When are these NOFOs going to drop? The likelihood was that those were for some new programs, and the federal agencies were still trying to stand those up. Those can take up to a year. And so there was a really accelerated timeline. You may have suffered from, once a NOFO was published, you may have found out you might have had 15 or 30 days to put together your application. That was why. They're trying to stand up the program at the same time they were trying to offer it. That has kind of evened out now that we're about 2 years in. But together, bill is now a compilation of over 350 programs in one fell swoop. And it was transformative in nature. And in doing so, what the federal government really did was they broadened their definition of infrastructure. And we're linking the outcomes to quality of life issues. So it's just bigger. We typically think of infrastructure as bricks and mortar projects, and there's still tons of those. But now they also include public health, broadband access, climate resiliency, workforce development, and infrastructure is now defined as both physical and human. And that's both from the perspective of sustainability and equity. And I think this is really kind of an outgrowth of the pandemic. First we saw the CARES Act for the pandemic, we moved through ARPA, but the pandemic really kind of cast a spotlight on where all of our structural cracks were. And Bill and IRA and the CHIPS and Science Act are really our means to try to address some of those systemic issues that we've been really looking at for generations. Next slide. And so what Bill has really done for us, and again, all of the others, at this point in time, they've reshaped our thinking. This is a monumental shift in how the federal government also looks at grant proposals. And it's important to have that understanding because the project now is really not just defined as a physical asset, but it's also reviewed in context of the human and social capital necessary to support thriving communities. In short, we've been asked to think a lot bigger. And when we look at our planned infrastructure investments, we want to kind of take another look at them and say, where do we gain a greater return on our investments? How do we achieve economies of scale? How do these projects contribute to a well-paid workforce? And does that workforce reflect the demographics in the communities in which these projects are taking place? So we've been asked to do a lot. We've been asked to increase our collaboration to solve problems at a very large scale. And so, my second piece of advice to folks when they're asking about federal funding is always to be, don't chase the funding. If the first time you're thinking about a project is when that NOFO drops, you're already kind of at a disadvantage. But, kind of flip that around and think about being ready with a solid project for when the opportunity arises. And think about opportunities to partner with others, including Indian tribes, state governments, and in some cases, federal agencies. And most importantly, the communities in which these projects are taking place. I want to give a shout out to Connie. She's one of my Rio colleagues. Take advantage of technical assistance that's out there. I've never seen the technical assistance available through the federal government that there is now. Every federal agency has web pages, FAQs, webinars, just tons of information, really step by step that give you insight as to how to complete an application package for their particular funding opportunity, and also what that agency is looking for. Engage the program office and ask questions before you really dive into something. And, Connie's group is really funded by the EPA, and a lot of federal agencies now have really also funded these kind of technical assistance think tanks where they can really work with you one-on-one. And I suggest that because your average NOFO, I've seen them as small as 35 pages. They can go in over 100 pages. Before you really do a deep dive into that, just kind of take a look at everything to make a good decision. And so just shifting gears for a moment, part of, as we kind of get into the details here, one of the terms that has popped up under bill is shovel-worthy. And shovel-ready is something that kind of came from ARA, if anyone remembers, back to 2009. So what I've found in talking with folks, they tend to use this shovel-ready and shovel-worthy interchangeably, and they're really not. Shovel-ready, again, goes back to ARA, and when we really go back to think of what was the main intent of ARA at that time, we were coming out of a recession in which what the main point of that bill was to really create jobs. And funds became available quickly. They and only for a short period of time. So in order to get people working, the government was really looking for those shovel-ready jobs. They wanted them on the ground. They wanted people working, and very successful toward that end. And so only shovel projects were selected. And what we mean by shovel-ready, because there's still a place for that in bill, where they're looking for projects that already have permitting approvals. They've already got detailed plans and specs. They can start immediately or within a very short period of time. And then they already have funding available. And by that, I mean probably the matching funds if those are necessary. Next slide. As opposed to shovel-worthy, right? Today, Bill and ARA and CHIPS and Science, what are we dealing with today? Number one, we're still kind of coming out of a pandemic in which our crumbling infrastructure, we really cast a spotlight on that. And also things like broadband. So what we're looking at is long-term investments required at a very large scale. So again, it's not really just about can we start building, but can we think this through? Can we build something that's sustainable for the long haul? And that also creates good paying jobs and sustainable jobs, and to make sure that these jobs go to people who live in these communities. So it's not really just about shovel ready. It's about shovel worthy. And so those projects are a little bit longer in the pipeline, right? They're based on sound decision making and sustainable over the next 20 years. So where does that really take us? And that really takes us back to the planning process. It's really strategic planning. And so while those may not be funded immediately because they're not really ready to go, they can receive planning funds, they can receive development support, so that ultimately we can position projects that become shovel ready in the future, and then we kind of tie them back to those metrics. Next slide. And so, commercial break. But before we kind of go any further, I feel the need to mention the uniform guidance. None of this is for the faint of heart, right? Grants, like everything else in the federal government, is governed by regulations, and in the grants world, we're guided by 2 CFR 200. You know, and obviously we just don't have the time to go into that today, but I don't want to take it off I don't want to take it out of the equation. It's important to know that they're out there and they govern every part of the federal funding project life cycle. And that goes for the federal agency, along with you as the non-federal entity or the applicant. We're all required to comply with those. And simply stated, you know, if you're applying for grants, you've been thinking about it. The time to start familiarizing yourself with those is now. And that really doesn't mean, you know, you've got to read these from cover to cover, but it's important to familiarize yourself with the regulations that you're going to be most working with, where they live, how they're used. You know, if it's with EPA, they have a set of regulations. Whether it's the DOT, they've got a set of regulations. Financial management, internal controls, where the grant stuff lives, 2 CFR 200. You'll be better positioned to proactively decide what the program's best fit is with regard to your own project pipeline and what program compliance looks like. And even the most cursory understanding of the uniform guidance is valuable for all, you know, the reasons I'm putting up here on the screen. First and foremost, avoid mistakes. You're not off the hook, right? You may make a mistake because you just didn't know, understandable, but you're still responsible, you're still accountable. And also it saves time. Sometimes when you know this stuff, you just think, wow, I could have done this the whole time and I didn't even know. Be prepared. And I think I'm mentioning this now because it's really important is, you know, should you get an award and you are responsible for managing the project and managing the money, and it's determined that maybe it's more than you thought, if you kind of take a look at what you're in for in that NOVO's terms and conditions, you can think it through and say, hey, maybe I'll need another team member. Maybe I'll need some new software. All of that can start to become part of your project and part of your funding request. So again, the time to start kind of familiarizing yourself is now. And, you know, information is power. You know, you just become more competitive the more you know. So next slide. Before we kind of move on to this next part, I just thought this might be a good opportunity to see if anyone has any questions. And if not, we have a Q&A at the end too. So
yeah, I don't see any in the chat at the moment, but if anyone has one and they would like to unmute themselves, they're welcome to. Okay, I think we can keep going then.
Okay. So now that we kind of have that context, we kind of know what the rules are, and we've got our passion project. How do we tell our story? And I'm going to be honest with you, I'm going to include myself in this. I've not met very many people who woke up one day wanting to be a grant writer. They just didn't think that was on their path. But everyone I've met is passionate about the work they do, the project they're working on, or the problems that they're trying to solve. And that's really what brings folks to the table. These projects are in our line of work tend to have very high price tags. It almost automatically points you into the grants world, whether that's, you know, federal funding, philanthropy, any number. And actually I'm one of them, and that's kind of how the relationship I have with Connie. I'm looking for money too, so just PS, putting that out there. But a compelling story allows for you to speak authentically as to the who and why, and knowing the rules of the funder help you define it in context of the what, where, and the how. You know, and it's really the intersectionality of these things in which you demonstrate your project need and the rules of the funder as identified in the NOFO. This is really where success lies. And, you know, the thing is, there's really there's no right way to do this. I've always felt it's both an art and a science. But that said, and, you know, you know, we have a handout here, and I meant to share that with you. And whether you have it or not, it's okay. But if you want to open it up, it's fine. It's a little handout that I put together for my Rio friends when we started to look at EPA's Community Change Grant. Again, now that NOFA was probably, I don't know, between 75 and 100 pages. So I felt part of my job was to really digest that on their behalf. Don't need to make folks read all of that. And when it really gets right down to it, get about a bunch of folks around the table. Is there something here? Can we really pursue this? Is this a good idea? And the way I really broke this down is in two ways. And the handout also does have a hyperlink to the NOFO itself if you'd like to read it. But number one, do you meet the basic threshold criteria? And also I like this because there's two tracks. One is the shovel ready, and then track two is the shovel worthy. I want to focus on the shovel ready because there's just a lot more involved with a construction project. But first and foremost, and it's, and I don't know, sometimes I get lost in why people miss this, but is there an eligible applicant and an eligible project? I mean, those are two big ones. With regard to this EPA challenge grid, the first thing you'll notice is eligible applicants, there need to be two of you, right? You need a lead and a partner, statutory partner. One of them must be a community-based organization. So all of a sudden you're thinking like, oh, I wasn't thinking that. So you have to think that through. Do we have an eligible project? In my handout, there are certain project types, and I took those right from the NOFO. If you go to the NOFO itself, there's a bigger explanation. So if you really think you're onto something, you always want to go back there. Is your project shovel ready? In the handout, it'll describe to you, what does that mean from EPA's perspective for purposes of this NOFO? And I feel the big ask is, do you have a project that costs between 10 and $20 million? Now, City of Phoenix, probably, that's not even enough money. I don't know. But, when we start to talk to some of these smaller communities and a lot of rural communities, gosh, are you even speaking to me? And I hear this in a lot of tribal communities. The good thing about this opportunity is there's no match required. So, if you have a $10 million project, then you are getting $10 million from the federal government. But can you come up with a $10 million project? Now, in this particular NOFO, the 20 million cap was fixed. The 10 million is not necessarily fixed, but what it really communicates is this is the scale and magnitude that they're looking for. So if you have maybe a $7 or $8 million project, I think they might consider it, maybe. A $3 million project, I think what it's telling you is like, no, this is a different scale and magnitude, probably not this one. And so that's why this is important. And for all of these questions, if you can't answer yes, then the conversation really is, it's not today, but gosh, are we almost there? And could we look at this opportunity next year? Or, what, the answer is no. And we don't want to waste anybody's time. And, at least we figured it out today, right? And so this threshold criteria is a great idea to really think through before moving on to, next slide. The evaluation criteria that is specifically stated in the NOFO. And just from a tactical position, strategic position, I always tend to look at the ones for which the federal agency is assessing, giving you the most points, right? How are you in those categories? And obviously they've broken them all down. And this is a chart that's in the NOFO itself, but also in the NOFO, in each one of these, they have very detailed descriptions of what they mean when they're talking performance management plan, or what they're talking about when they mean project linkages. So again, you want to read that more thoroughly, but this is the piece. It's no longer about eligibility. It's really about competitiveness. And when you kind of go through this exercise, you want to make sure you've read that NOFO thoroughly. You've taken advantage of the technical assistance, whether they're webinars, the FAQs, and you're still on board, right? And here you kind of use the opportunity to assess your strengths, understand whether or not you have some gaps. Are your strengths in those areas where they're going to give you lots of points? Are your gaps where they're going to assess lots of points? Because all of these things are kind of telling you this is how much we're going to have to invest in this story. Do we have a compelling story? And there's really no application in the federal government at this point in time in which your story doesn't need to be supported with data, and I mean good data, to support that request. And again, there's bunches of ways to get data, and you don't want to really do this in a vacuum. You just really want to you just want to ask for help because it's generally available at this point in time. Next slide. So again, those are kind of questions only you can answer, but that said, there are a couple of things that stand out in almost every successful grant proposal. And again, I'm talking about from a reviewer's mindset. One of the things that a reviewer is going to kind of hone in on, pretty much first and foremost, they're going to look at your budget. What does your budget say? What does it say about you? It tells its own story, right? And they're going to assess cost reasonableness. So if you're proposing this ginormous project and your budget, a small budget can be reviewed just as much, you may ask for too much money, but if you're not asking for enough, the questions are going to arise. Do you understand the project for which you're requesting funding? Do you have the capacity to deliver that project? So you want to be able to demonstrate a reasonable project scope, timeline, and budget, and those must be very well integrated. Clearly define the problem and describe how you're going to solve it. And a clear story, clear and compelling, talk about the challenge, and detail it at the local level. A lot of these programs are all put together because we understand what the challenges are at a national level. What does that look like on the ground where you are, such that you have determined to come together as a group to solve these problems? Align with the evaluation criteria, data-driven, reasonable and justifiable outcomes, and emphasize the community impact, and that's never really been more important than it is now, particularly to underserved communities. And in the case of the EPA Community Challenge Grant, 100% of the funding was going to those EJ communities or environmental justice communities. Next slide. So, and then of course there are some things that you really just don't want to do because they're gonna set you off track right off the bat. These are the things that a reviewer will pick up like a hawk. Obviously late application submissions, that's just a no-go. Years ago, we would get emails and say, hey, I tried to submit on my application and I couldn't get it through grants.gov, will you still take it? Years ago, with a good excuse and your ability to justify that, we would have taken those applications. That's no longer the case. You missed the deadline, you missed the deadline. And a lot of things are out of your control, they're out of the federal agency's control. It all takes you back to sam.gov and grants.gov. That's a conversation for a whole nother day. Incorrect file format, it seems like maybe it's ridiculous in its concept, but when they tell you that they need this application in 35 pages and they're not going to review page 36, you need to take that quite seriously because you don't want like the secrets to the universe on page 37 because no one will know that it's there. And I think the others are kind of obvious, unclear, anything that's unclear, because you're a reviewer is never going to be familiar with your project. They may not be familiar with the location. They just may not be familiar. And so you need to write it as if it's the first time anyone has ever seen it. And all of these things I feel are related to those things. Multiple unrelated scopes of work, insufficient data, ineligible project types. Those are just the things that you want to avoid. And I just kind of want to get back to EPA as it relates to Rio. Obviously, based on what sphere you work in, you may kind of gravitate toward a particular federal agency. And I would spend a lot of time scrubbing those websites to see what it is that they have to offer. I have found, honestly, even with all my experience, I find value in a webinar because every once in a while there's a kernel in there that someone will say, and they're really just kind of stating what's in the NOFA, but they will give you some insight into what they're really looking for. So, and now we're going to move in, before we move into this next topic, does anyone have any questions with regard to that? Yeah. I have to move quickly. I'm so sorry about the time. All right. So, gosh, we've covered a lot of ins and outs of the funding criteria, but as we know that there's just a lot of costs within in the federal context, and in order to determine whether this is a good fit, let's just talk a little bit about what is that award actually costing you. And I always break this down into long-term goals versus short-term costs. The long-term goals are really the federal priorities, right? The grants, a federal agency is going to really award grants to those that are really supporting specific federal objectives and understanding those goals is essential for the project planning. Investments, implementing federal priorities may justify those costs if they lead to those broader societal benefits identified in the NOFO. And, that just might cost you more. And I think for things like, Davis-Bacon and Buy American and just compliance with all of the regulations, that might mean bringing on a team of folks that you don't have right now, because you're going to have to manage that and report on that. And of course, compliance. There's just a lot that goes into adhering with those federal regulations, whether it's reporting, again, those labor standards and procurement practices. Again, some of those things can be built into your budget, but again, there's always a ceiling on it. And so you need to ask yourself, are you going to have enough to actually do your project? So in terms of the short-term impacts, those can affect you, your direct costs, which are, your actual expenses for the project that you kind of started out with. Again, those administrative costs and those compliance costs. I can't spend any more time on Davis-Bacon, but in the handout, I've got some links for Davis-Bacon and Build America, Buy America. And again, what we're really looking at, if you look at those larger priorities, you really do need to kind of think of it in terms of economic impact. It's not just the project itself, but it's how does the project also build the economy from the federal perspective. And that's really with, providing people with a living wage, domestic manufacturing, all of those things. That could add to your timeline, could add to your budget. And so again, what is the answer to that? In all cases, successful project outcomes really depend on careful planning, alignment with federal priorities, and a commitment to achieving the mission of that granting agency. So at the end of the day, my friends, only you can answer this question: is the juice worth the squeeze? But there are some online resources, and I put them up here very quickly. We can go through those. I'd love to have spent some time searching with you, but if we move through the slides, obviously grants.gov is the mothership here. Not everyone loves grants.gov, and not all funding opportunities are listed on grants.gov. But that said, I also want to bring to your attention, just spend some time on this site. Grants.gov offers lots of training. They offer training in workspace. And if you look at the Connect tab, you can sign up for subscriptions. So if you're tracking agencies or funding opportunities, you can ask for emails alerts so that when those NOFOs drop, you'll get it automatically. They don't spam or anything like that, but it's worth some time. And I included the QR code, for you to just kind of spend some time on that site. Next slide. So, when I was working with the governor's office, I worked closely with the National Governors Association, and honestly, this is my favorite website. They have really gone out of their way, when these bills were first passed, to just build knowledge for everyone, whether it was, federal agencies, state agencies, local governments, folks like myself, what's going on with these programs. And so if you click on this QR code, you scroll all the way pretty much down to the bottom. They call it IJA. Bill is IJA, IIJA. You've got IJA resources, you've got IRA resources, CHIPS and Science resources. You click on those, they're little bubbles. And if you scroll all the way down to the bottom of that, you'll see their grants trackers. So they have open notices of funding opportunities, but they have the whole list of programs under each one of these bills for which you can search. Am I an Indian tribe? Am I a rural community? Am I interested in the environment? Am I interested in what's out there today? You can search through all of those things. Next slide. And then of course, there's my little website, and I have been known to blog about this stuff once in a while. So, and primarily working with Rio, I really started to tap into this stuff in a little bit deeper to be of value to the folks working in the Rio community, and I'm sharing that with you now. And that said, I know, gosh, we're right up on the hour. To the extent that we want to know more, this might be another subject for another blog at some time. And I guess our Q&A is like down to the buzzer, but but I'm also happy to take the conversation offline.